Hello and welcome to another instalment of the Self-Managed Super Fund Industry Roundtable. I'm your host, Michael Killicoat, and today we'll be discussing the issues around related party loans in an SMSF. And joining me today, as usual, are some industry experts. As usual, my regular guest, Ben Anderson from Future Estate. Welcome, Ben.
Good morning, Michael. Thank you for having me.
And also Phil Allen, SMSF strategist from Laura Dean Financial Solutions. Welcome, Phil.
Morning. Thank you very much.
And also joining us is Grant Abbott, the chairman of the Australian SMSF Members Association. Welcome, Grant.
Okay, thanks for that, Michael.
Now, if we can just start off, guys, at the high level, just what are related party loans in an SMSF?
I think if we can probably pull back and actually say that probably the last 4 or 5 years, and particularly in the last couple of years, there's been an ability for self-managed super funds to borrow money, and that's really accelerated now that we've got every bank effectively lending at very good, attractive rates, and I'm sure Phil will talk about that a little bit more because he's right down the strategy level. So we've had this great capacity of these banks now starting to lend to self-managed super funds. It's rumoured that this year there'll be 70,000 funds going through the borrowing process. So people are now making use of their superannuation, and we're not talking about retirees because retirees generally won't borrow to go into property. We're talking about people who are 28, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, who are effectively using their superannuation to effectively go and borrow property. And it could be anywhere, from Darlinghurst, something that's got a good yield on it. The major sticking point, though, is for any younger person is to, if they put their money into superannuation as a contribution, like they've got their SGC, but if they make additional contributions, they can't access that money until age 60. So it's always been a big deterrent, particularly for the baby boom generation, which is my era. We're sort of stuck away from super and done all our property investment outside because we couldn't touch the money. But the beauty about this new system is that we can now use our equity in our property that we might have, or any investment properties or surplus cash. Instead of contributing into super and locking it away, we can make a related party loan to the superannuation fund, which means we can put that money that it would otherwise be locked away in our home or other investment properties, put it inside super, and we can do it at low interest rates. In fact, the Commission has just come out and said we can do it at a nil interest rate. Although I wouldn't do that. If you're going back-to-back loans, you'd obviously do, if you're borrowing it on your home loan at 7, you're obviously going to lend exactly the same thing. But the beauty about it is it actually means that once you've done that, the money's in there working for you in a very low tax environment. In fact, we can get into negative gearing inside our super fund, so we're not paying any tax at all. And we're also reducing our contributions tax. But at the end of the day, we've got that magic potion that if we need that money for our kids' education or a problem, as long as the cash is sitting in there, we can pull it out at a moment's notice. And certainly Phil will be able to tell you
definitely.
that.
Well, as Greg was saying, you don't necessarily need to go to the banks anymore to borrow money to buy in your super fund. So you can actually lend your super fund the money to finalise the purchase. That can be to prop up a bank loan, so you might have 80% from a bank loan. If someone traditionally might have $150,000 or $200,000 in a super fund, it may be hard for them to buy 1 or 2 properties and take advantage of some of the products that Ben has. So in the last month, in fact, we've done 30 related party borrowings through Grant's company as well. So it's a growing trend, and it's an easy way to buy multiple properties.
And I think the point Grant makes is a good one, that younger generations within super probably don't want to have their money locked up until they're 60 years old. It's a long time away. So it's an opportunity to build your fund balance and invest in property or other assets within that lower tax environment. But then you do have that flexibility, and I think the flexibility would be appealing and as an alternative to a contribution where you couldn't get it back out.
I think what most people sort of miss is that, I do quite a few property expos on behalf of Phil and do a lot of talks, and I'm sure he'll talk about the stuff he's doing in Mackay, but I do a lot of talks, and you see all these guys that are out there and they get real excited, build 20 properties in $1 million, worth $1 million in 5 or 6 years. But the underlying philosophy they're missing out on is they're not one of those speakers. They talk about, look at your depreciation, look for this, get that, do that. Now, one of them talk about the end tax rates, and the tax is important because you might get the tax deductions on the way through, but if you've done really well and you sell it, you're up for capital gains tax. Or when you get to retirement, which primarily what these people are looking at doing is when you get to retirement, there's no gearing on it, so you're paying full tax on that income. Whereas if you achieve that result, exactly the same, you want to go and get all your investment properties, but you build it up, develop it, put it inside your superannuation fund. When you turn 55 or 60, you actually can move into the pension phase of the fund where it's tax-free. So the smart people who are doing it actually have got this tax-free income, tax-free if they want to sell the property, and potentially also if they've done it structured well, that when they pass away and the money goes to their spouse, those properties go to the spouse tax-free. So exactly the same portfolio, but one, because they're ignorant, not ignorant, they don't know that, because they don't go down that track and do their own research and use guys like Phil, they're destined for a lot poorer retirement than you would be in a self-managed. It's like the industry funds. They say, well, you know, we're much better because we don't have commission. I'd say both of them are rubbish, as is investing in property outside, because people are actually paying tax. And tax in the long run is going to kill you.
So there are a lot of tax implications to consider, and I understand they're constantly changing. So maybe what are some of the recent ones, and how do
I'll give you an
people keep on
example.
top of it?
Would you like an example?
Please.
We have a client which we're just working on with Grant. It's quite a large one, and he'll have an income from property. He's 63 years of age, so going into retirement mode, and he'll have an income of about $1 million a year in rental income. So the tax on that, Grant?
Yeah, that's probably about $450,000 or $400,000.
Normally,
Yep.
But in the SMSF market, of course, that'll be zero. So that's very attractive for people. And that's why there's such a preponderance for people to want to get into the property market, because you can now gear, and obviously gearing outside and inside, the strategy is exactly the same, and the end result is the same, that you're using a very small amount of your money to create a large asset. So in the event of Ben's project in Mackay, we've just sold about 30 properties there for about 400 to 500,000 each. But people are only using a very small amount of their money in their super fund. We can borrow the rest. If they don't have enough in their super fund, but they have, as Grant said earlier, if they have equity in their own home, or in my case, and I'll give you some examples later, if you have cash available, you can actually lend that cash to your super fund, and you can either forgive it and it becomes part of your super fund, or you can hold the loan back and get it cashed out at a later date. So it's become very, very popular.
And I think one of the big changes has been that there's rules that changed in 2010, and effectively, like when this first came out, you could only borrow about 50 or 60% LVR. Now it's up to 80, and it's increasing. As Phil said, it's quite a commonplace occurrence for people to borrow 80 from the bank and then put in the other 20% themselves as a related party loan, plus pay stamp duty, plus pay for, the laws allow you to borrow for future repairs. So you might do a credit line for, if the roof falls off or whatever. So we can actually structure all these things around. The other one is you can't borrow to improve the property, but you can use your cash resources inside the fund to improve the property. So the way it is, a typical case study would be, the Gen Xers, like you guys, the Gen X to Gen Y, that pull their money out of their industry or retail fund, plonk it over to their self-managed superannuation fund, find like a $400,000 property that needs work done on it. Then what they would do is they would take any equity if they've got other investment properties out as the deposit, as a related party loan, borrow from the bank, and effectively what you've done is you've put a property in your super fund, paying no money, no money down. And the beauty about it is, though, you've got that money sitting inside your self-managed super fund, which was being laid waste out in the retail industry funds. It's now there, and it can be used to improve your current property. So that's the smart strategy way of doing it. And these guys are both, they probably both tell you that the developments they're doing up in Mackay, and I've done quite a few talks for them, but the ability to buy property virtually at a wholesale price. And I think that's the thing that's sort of missing in the market, which is, I know Ben's done a lot of talks in the trustee market and the advisor market, that it's a very exciting concept.
And for Grant, it might be worth this point to touch off on for the audience at home. If they're they see that there's an opportunity to make a related party loan to their fund, what are some of the things they might need to consider in terms of documentation, in terms of term, and the way in which that's actually structured?
I think anything like this is not like don't go to a mortgage broker.
Yeah.
I love mortgage brokers to death, and don't go to a solicitor. God forbid,
don't go to a bank.
Don't go to a bank. I think the main thing to do is to go to someone who is adept at doing those. And Phil's classic. I mean, if he's done 30 of them, he knows the ins and outs because I've seen a number, and it's I notice with the younger, well, not the younger, the Gen X and Gen Ys, they'll go and research it or go and do a couple of things, and they'll say, well, I know everything about it. And then what happens is, if they are going to, they do a related party, or they say the wrong word to the bank, and what will happen is the whole thing blows up, and it ends up costing them $10,000 to $20,000, a lot of heartache. And Phil and our firm, the legal firm, we've had to fix up people's messes, and that's been at the 11th minute when settlements coming around and the bank's saying, well, we're not going to lend to you anymore because this documentation wasn't right from 15 years ago or something.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, and a lot of the bank managers aren't equipped either with the knowledge to how to handle a setup like this. It is very specialised, and if you do the wrong thing, as Grant said, there are pretty hefty penalties as well. So I think it's worth the expense of going to see. It's not an expense, really, an investment in seeing a specialist who does that sort of thing. Yeah.
Good to hear. I had one particular question. I saw an issue. You mentioned earlier that you could get a 0% loan. I understand there's implications for setting the rates too low or too high. What are some of those issues?
When the laws came out, I mean, they were always structured that obviously the bank's got its normal commercial rates, and a number of lawyers, and unfortunately we've got quite a few conservative unknowing lawyers inside the industry. Whereas, you know, they were saying, look, you can't do this, you can't do that. The smarter people in the industry have actually gone to the tax office and argued their case and seen what the tax office, who is the regulator, has to say about it. And we've been very lucky that probably the last 6 months, the tax office really has got a big team of lawyers, and they've really actually been on our side. They've come back and said that you can offer interest rates at 0 or at 1%. And the difference between what a bank would lend at, which is, let's say that's the market rate, and 1%, that's not impacted by the superannuation laws. And it's also not there was a number of lawyers saying, well, obviously it's a contribution. But the Commissioner says, well, if you reduce the liability, that's not a contribution. A contribution actually has to be an increase in assets. Unfortunately, a lot of lawyers don't know the difference in a balance sheet between, you know, an asset and a liability, as most smart financial people would do. But that's why they're lawyers, I suppose, and generally quite poor at that. But anyway, from that is the Commissioner's come out and clarified and said that you can do it at lower interest rates. But as I said before, is that if you're borrowing on the equity of a bank, you have to understand, if you want to get a tax deduction for that borrowing, you're then on lending to the super fund, you're getting assessable income. If you're borrowing at 7 on lending at 2, then effectively you're going to miss out on a tax deduction of the differential, that 5%.
Yeah.
Okay, just moving along, turn to you again, Phil. Do you have some examples or scenarios?
Yeah, well, I'll give you
this one
my example. What I've done the last probably 3 months is a good example of what you can do. Typical of a baby boomer, nearing retirement at 60, or well, probably won't retire, but certainly coming close to 60. About 3 years ago, we made a decision to wind down my property portfolio outside of super and push it all into super. So in the last 3 or 4 months, I've actually purchased 4 properties inside my super. The setup in there is the holding trust. I don't know whether we've been through that before, but each property has to go into its own holding trust, and it can have one trustee. With the trustees, of course, you're better off to have what we use is a corporate trustee, and that's a whole session we can do on why you would do that, but it's a good little safety valve in case someone decides to leave the fund. But in there, obviously my super didn't have enough in there to put the deposit down on 4 different properties, so I had equity, so I used the equity in my property to lend my super fund a couple of $100,000. That then we could put a deposit on the 4 properties and borrow from the banks as well.
I think it's probably important to pick up on the actual structuring of why it's set up like that, is that the basic superannuation laws are to protect all members' super benefits.
Yeah.
So they changed the Bankruptcy Act in 2007 and said that whatever sits inside your fund can't be touched by your trustee in bankruptcy. And then at the same time they come out and they say, okay, well, we're going to allow banks to lend and individuals can lend, or family trusts can lend to super. So how's that going to work if your trustee in bankruptcy can't touch those assets? So what they had to come up with is a structure, and what they do is they call it a holding trust. And a holding trust is just simply a trust whereby it becomes the legal owner. You're still the trustee of it. You set up this trust, it's just a bare trust. It becomes the legal owner of the property, but the underlying borrowing is still with the super fund. So the super fund still controls it, but at the end of the day, if the super fund, if something goes wrong and the super fund can't repay, and that might be, for example, the major contributor to the fund dies or has an accident, and I think that probably I'll defer to Phil on that for insurances and stuff like that, they're really crucial. But if you look at the major person dies and then the fund has to walk away from that, the bank only has recourse as against that property. So it can't sue the members or the trustees. That's why there's this artificial edifice being the holding trust. It's painful because it costs a little bit more, but at the end of the day, it's actually there to protect that
It's a good
super
safety
fund.
valve.
Yeah, and the insurance, I mean, what do you normally recommend to clients?
Yeah, absolutely. They take at least cover their life insurance to cover the debts that they're on in their super funds, because the funds can accept the money if someone dies and replace those loans, pay them down. Yeah.
And I think that the point Grant makes about the non-recourse loans within super is an important point to make, because outside of super, obviously when you borrow for an investment property or for a home loan, it's full recourse to the borrower, right, which means in the event that you're unable to repay those loans, they could pursue you and pursue your personal assets to the full extent of that loan. Right, so there's no limit to that liability until the full loan is repaid. Within super, it's obviously limited to that bare trust and the amount of the property itself. So there is a limited exposure, and it doesn't expose the balance of the fund assets. So it's actually from an investment property perspective and from a borrower perspective, it's a real benefit.
Definitely.
Okay, for listeners who might be interested in pursuing a related party loan, what should they do next?
Oh, well, they'd contact their a member of SPA, or of course they can come and see us at lauradean.com.au, but definitely deal with an expert.
I would say that probably anyone with super, because this has been around and the Labor government has flagged it. I'm about to do a talk in a couple of weeks to the Australian Industry Super Fund trustees, and the talk is on why people are leaving industry super funds with $50,000 to $100,000 to acquire property. And of course that raises a red flag, and the government said, look, we might be reviewing this. So I think that the first thing for anyone who's seeing this is to stop, look at your super, and half the time you don't even know where it is. So you might as well just go onto the ATO website and find your lost super, and then just think that the bank's going to lend me 80%. So if I want to go and buy a $350,000 apartment, God, I live up at Potts Point, you can get $250,000 apartments paying you $350 a week. If you're going to do that, you only need like $50,000 to actually get a good long-term income that at the end of the day, you build up those 4 or 5 portfolios. Phil's unfortunately had to do it too late.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And I'm doing it too late.
We all are.
The best time to do it is actually when you're young, at your age, and at Ben's age, because if you can get in then, that's prime, because there's a window of opportunity, and I can tell you, windows of opportunity with any tax system don't last that long.
Yeah, especially in the growth area where Ben's got his development in Mackay, the opportunity's now.
Yes,
it's a great opportunity.
And by using related party borrowing strategies, it could mean younger generations can access those type of investment opportunities now, and over time, if they wanted to, could forgive that loan and effectively it could become a contribution to the fund, but they have the ability to pull it out. Yeah, that's the real benefit of the strategies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm afraid we're out of time for today, but Grant Abbott, thanks for joining us, and Phil Allen,
thank you,
and Ben Anderson.
Thanks, Michael.
Okay, another interesting discussion for the Self-Managed Super Fund Industry Roundtable. I'm your host, Michael Killicoat from BRR Media. Thanks for watching.